Hello and welcome back to the Walking Dead retrospective. Today we will pick up right where we left off in Season 1 and Issue 9 and talk about all the changes the adaptation made when taking the Hershel's farm arc to screen. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, do all the YouTube things to help with the blessing of the algorithm, but with the brief intro out of the way, let's get into Season 2 and the respective comic book issues 9 through 12. Though just before we get into the events themselves, we'll once again have to have a bit of a meta conversation surrounding Season 2, and there's some pretty spicy stuff here, so strap in. If you recall, in the first video we talked about the Vatos scene that had been cut from the Season 2 premiere. Well, in reality, most if not all of the episode was changed in production. Going off of the success of Season 1, Darabont was hoping to get an increased budget that would allow him to tell his vision of the story. In an interview with Ain't It Cool News, he said that the premiere would feature a battalion of soldiers to secure Atlanta. We'd get to see all the events that ultimately led to the zombie in the tank, coming full circle to the premiere where Rick is escaping the horde and ends up next to him. Allegedly, AMC thought that this sort of anthology approach would take too much away from the main narrative of Rick and the survivors, and chop the show's budget by 35%. And a quick note for the future, this budgeting decision will become much more prevalent for later seasons. Returning to Darabont's vision, he did not respond well to AMC's decision making and sent out the infamous email which I will now read to you. It will of course be censored because the YouTube overlords do not like certain words here, but the article is in the description. I am the writer's room. The lazy f***s who were supposedly going to be my showrunners threw that responsibility on me after wasting 5 months of my time. If it were up to me, I'd not only have fired two names that I don't know how to pronounce, when they handed me the worst episode 3 script imaginable, I'd have hunted them down, them with a brick, then gone and burned down their homes. And here's another one just for some good fun. You need to pay attention to the script. I even chose my commas for a reason. Why am I working so hard if you're shooting everything some other way that doesn't work? In short, Darabont was not happy in the least. Whether this sort of reaction is justified, I'll leave that to you. But there is more to the story. This whole drama led to a years-long lawsuit between Darabont and AMC, which is still ongoing even today. Long story short, he claimed that there had been some shady business going on and that his profits were not adequate. There's a lot more to it and I don't really think it's worth getting into for the purposes of this video, but the articles are again in the description if you want to look into it. Ultimately, Darabont was succeeded by Glenn Mazzara, who would be the showrunner to the end of Season 3. Again, keep this in mind for later, as this will be very relevant for the next installments in this series. Finally, getting into the events themselves. The TV series picks up shortly after we left off. The group has escaped the CDC and are simply trying to find somewhere to settle down again. And despite the episode being shot in a quite frantic manner due to the whole Darabont debacle and a tight budget, we did get to see the awesome highway episode. Another quick meta note here, this would be the same site for some future episodes. If you were paying close attention, this is where Season 7, Episode 10 was shot, but more on that when we get there. Unlike the comic version where they were already in the dead of winter, this whole thing takes place in the blazing Georgia heat. So instead of looking for warm clothes and a place to settle down for the winter, the survivors are looking for water and other essentials to keep going, with a place to settle down being the second priority. Another thing that I feel like is important to mention here is that the TV show continues to expand on Glenn's character even more. Just like with the Atlanta arc where he's given a lot more screen time, the same thing happens here. He along with Dale are trying to repair the RV, and this sort of mentor relationship will play out for a lot of Season 2. Just a few moments later, Rick spots the horde coming their way, and that's when this episode gets going. Everyone gets underneath the cars and tries to hide out while they pass. And again, this is, not surprisingly, a TV show exclusive, and was likely thought up fairly close to beginning production, based on the Darabont conversation we just had. In the midst of this horde, Sophia runs off with a walker chasing her. Rick follows, protects Sophia, and tells her to hide. And so begins one of the most controversial arcs in the TV series. Though, before we get to that, I think it's worth talking about Rick's approach to this whole thing. If you recall what I mentioned about Rick's use of melee weapons fairly early in the comics, in contrast, when saving Sophia, Rick, reluctant to use his gun to avoid drawing even more walkers, says that he can only take on one of them at a time. Needless to say, these are very much the early days of Rick's development, and we see that even a few of the dead are quite a bit of hassle to put down. And it's also important to know that most of them still don't carry any hand-to-hand weapons, and so Rick has to use a rock to fight off the dead. I think it's also worth talking about how this decision would later affect Rick as a character, because ultimately, he was the one who left Sophia behind, obviously with the intention to protect her, though despite this, we would later see him feel guilty once we saw where she had actually ended up. We also see Daryl slowly becoming Rick's right-hand man, now helping him track down Sophia, which would of course ultimately become his primary mission in this season. And again, this entire Sophia storyline is a TV show exclusive. Speaking of which, now that we are caught up to where the comics left off, you might have noticed the major discrepancy between the first season and the number of issues it covered, and this one. Season 1 consisted of 6 episodes and covered roughly 9 issues. Season 2, however, consists of 13 episodes and covered a mere 3 issues. That's 1.5 issues per episode, down to roughly a quarter of an issue per episode. Though that is not an entirely fair comparison, as the Shane storyline is moved to Season 2, and there is a lot of remixing done later on. In short, all of this is to say that the Herschel's farm arc is much longer in the adaptation. After finding the machetes and knives, this is also the first time we start to see the survivors start to use melee weapons, though their precision is very much lacking in the early days, and we would only come back to this late Season 2. And finally, Shane is also talking about leaving the group and is heading off on his own. This would obviously never come to fruition, but is just sowing those seeds of conflict between him and the rest of the group, especially when Andrea overhears this conversation and would later talk to him about it as well. And thus, we have caught up to the comic. But before we continue any further, I wanted to talk a little more about my overall thoughts on the premiere, as it was vastly different from the books. Even without knowing what's going on behind the scenes, I remember this episode being absolutely stellar. The horde on the highway, Rick's solo stand against the infected, and Sophia going missing. Funnily enough, despite this episode being packed with events, it mostly takes place in a very small vicinity and essentially goes around in circles until the very end of the episode. And don't take this as a criticism, as it's the complete opposite in my opinion. Creative use of a limited budget and surroundings is a prime example of good writing, and I think this episode nails that. You'd think that portraying a whole horde would absolutely break the bank, right? Well, by having the characters hide under cars, we only get to see most of them pass, and close-ups are done for very few, thereby avoiding large costs in makeup, as the background walkers obviously don't need as much attention as the one-on-one encounters. Alright, enough about that. Let's get through the final moments of the premiere and then pick up the comic book for a bit. Rick, Shane, and Carl split off from the rest as they continue to search for Sophia, but suddenly a deer appears before them. Carl begins to approach it, only for a gunshot to ring out as we see both Carl and the deer fall to the ground. Note the quality of CGI here for the future, by the way. As for the comic book version, if you recall what I mentioned about Tyrese replacing Shane as Rick's right hand, that's exactly what happens here. Instead of searching for Sophia, they are simply hunting, and note Carl already using a legit shotgun here. Also, there's no deer. Carl is simply shot, with Otis coming out and saying he mistook them for an animal or a walker. And this is one of those times where I am unsure which version I actually prefer. In the comic, Carl getting shot completely out of the blue is, well, incredibly unexpected, and that's why it works. It just happens and the characters are left to deal with the consequences. The TV show, however, pulls on your emotions a bit more. We finally get a break from all the action and hopelessness we've seen throughout the premiere. They stumble upon this majestic deer, and for a moment, the characters are once again hopeful. Rick is watching Carl experience that childhood wonder, and even Shane, who was about to shoot the deer himself, is now smiling. And so the juxtaposition of the peaceful music and generally beautiful scene being interrupted by an abrupt silence with the only sound being a gunshot in the distance as they both hit the floor works extremely well here. And unlike the magical moment we just lingered on, the dread setting in only takes a few seconds as Rick and Shane realize what just happened. This again calls back to what I mentioned in Season 1. The TV series leverages the fact that it can linger on emotion with the added benefits of a live-action format, and so the surprise of the comic is replaced by a more calculated way of building to the climax. And I suppose in a bit of a meta sense, Carl being shot through the deer does seem more believable than Otis just confusing him for a walker. Rick's reaction to this is also quite a bit different between the two versions. Just like we've talked about quite a few times now, I feel like most of the characters in the books are a lot more on the edge and get hardened faster than in the TV adaptation. And so, before he even understands what is actually going on, rage takes over and he charges Otis with a gun. Ultimately, he just threatens him, but the reaction is still very different. And before we get to the TV version, the intro of episode 2 is a wonderfully placed flashback of Carl reacting to the news of Rick being shot. The parallels here should be obvious, with Shane being present even in the flashback. But we mostly skip over Rick's reaction to the whole thing, with the episode properly opening as Rick is already carrying Carl to Herschel's farm. The following events play out quite similarly between the two versions. Herschel goes absolutely ham and the mission to save Carl begins. The major difference in the adaptation, however, is from what comes after. The whole operation is much more serious in the TV version, including blood transfusions, several smaller shards having to be removed, and other complications. And this will be another catalyst, the first being Shane and the second being Sophia going missing, that would ultimately make the first part of the season much different from the books, but more on that later. In the comics, Herschel's family is a little different as well. Maggie is obviously there, but Beth is a TV show exclusive. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's worth going over all the characters in the house, as they won't exactly be around for too long, and frankly, there are just too many of them. Though what I absolutely want to mention is the difference in Herschel's character. Right from the get-go, I always liked the adaptation's version of the character magnitudes more. And I think this is 100% attributable to Scott Wilson's portrayal of him. I would be lying by saying that these thoughts are not at least somewhat affected by everything that comes next, but man, was he a fantastic actor. We will talk about this a lot more in later seasons, but he really elevated the character to new heights, and these episodes featuring Scott Wilson will forever stay in my memory. He passed away in 2018, with his final appearance being in Season 9. I don't know how I can put into words just how much I enjoyed seeing him in the show, so I suppose just keep that in mind. Let's not dwell on this sad note for too long and make our way forward. As I mentioned, Carl's recovery in the books is a lot faster, with him waking up and being somewhat okay as soon as issue 10. The comic book story then moves on to other matters on the farm and whether Rick's group may be able to join them. But we'll have to return to the TV show for now, as this does not happen for quite a while. With Carl still being in critical condition, Otis and Shane set out to find medical supplies. Meanwhile, most of the group is still on the highway and Rick is barely standing due to the amount of blood he is given. We cut back to Otis and Shane and things are looking just as dire for them, and it is at this point where Shane will become more and more unhinged over the course of this season. After realizing that there is no way they both will get out, he shoots Otis and leaves him as bait for the walkers while he escapes. And personally, I feel like these additions make Shane's transformation a lot more believable in the show, unlike the sudden snap in the books. We see him pushed into a position where it's either him sacrificing Otis or both of them would not make it out. He makes his decision, but that obviously changes a person, which is further shown visually by him buzzing his head clean, in part to hide the scar left by Otis, but also as a clear symbol that the old Shane is no more. It's also worth mentioning that if you're a cinema nerd like me, this episode is actually cyclic. The episode ends with the same exact scene it began. This episode is also spliced in with more searching for Sophia by Daryl and Andrea, as well as the first proper meeting between Glenn and Maggie. I won't dwell on the Daryl-Andrea duo, as we will talk about plenty about both of their characters later on, and this isn't really super important. It's just some nice banter between them. As for Glenn and Maggie, this is another dynamic that I personally found much more believable in the show than in the books. While the same line, which I will have to censor, will crop up later in the adaptation, their relationship evolves much slower. And as I mentioned with Scott Wilson as well as Steven Yeun in Season 1, I genuinely feel like a lot of this is down to the actors. While I liked seeing Glenn in the comics, he was never super high up for me, while in the adaptation, he was one of my favorite characters in the entire series, and so seeing his awkward, still better than me, relationship with Maggie develop was fun to see. The next couple of episodes largely focuses on the search for Sophia, while in the comics there's very little else that happens on the farm, and we pretty much get to the barn reveal right away. Though before we get to that, we do still have a few things to deal with in the adaptation. Firstly, it's the legendary conversation between Rick and Herschel that would later be emulated in Season 9. And man, is this a fantastic shot. Along with the Herschel line of it being good to pause for an occasion and just think. This of course has much more meaning in the universe that is The Walking Dead. The constant state of fear and struggle never allows for them just to slow down for a moment, and even when they do, moments like Carl being shot happen. It's sort of like a double-edged sword. Just like in real life, taking time to just reflect and think is extremely valuable. But there is a side to each and every one of us that just wants to keep going. Only here, they are forced to keep going. No matter how you look at it and whether you find any more meaning to it, I think it is just a beautiful scene. There's also the case of the bloated walker in the well, and I think this is one of those things that was added essentially as filler, but I think it kind of worked out for the best. Broadly speaking, it does not affect the overall plot in any meaningful way, but it did become a bit of a staple for Season 2, even getting its own figures. And on the notes of this, each season has some sort of signature walker. Season 1 has the bike zombie, Season 2 would be this well zombie, Season 3 has Michonne's walkers, and so on. And I think the well zombie is very strong thematically. Again, it's not crucial for the plot, but it was an interesting problem that the characters had to deal with. And a few quick things to mention before we move on. This episode keeps building on Daryl's search for Sophia, which would be a major thing for his character in the latter half of this season. We also get Rick putting away his police badges, which is clear foreshadowing for his character development in the upcoming few episodes. And finally, we find out that Lori is pregnant. Though, unlike the comics where Lori tells Rick right away, she keeps it a secret for a little while. The next episode is again a Sophia-centric one, with us following Daryl going solo and the duo of Rick and Shane. And it's here where we start to get a major split between Rick and Shane, as Shane begins to almost blame Rick for them still being here, even saying Carl wouldn't have gotten shot if they had just moved on. And after returning to the camp, Rick confides in Lori about what happened, questioning whether his way of leading really is flawed. Again, think back to him putting his badge away. This is very much slowly converting Rick to the much more cold leader that he would later become. And that's what I really enjoyed seeing here. Whether he agrees with Shane or not, it's no secret that his way of thinking is rubbing off on Rick. And slowly but surely, he does begin to approach these decisions in a calculated manner rather than as emotional as it has been so far. Meanwhile, Daryl almost gets himself killed and we see him hallucinate about Merle being there while egging him on. Seeing Michael Rooker appear again was certainly a lot of fun, and this whole excursion of Daryl, as I mentioned before, will all culminate after they find out what happened to Sophia. but just keep that in mind for now. As he makes his way back, he is mistaken for a walker by Andrea and is almost shot. This is also a difference between the two versions. In the books, she is an incredible shot, and while they tried to portray this in the adaptation, I feel like they kind of missed the mark on that, no pun intended. And skipping ahead a little, once Daryl recovers, we get the awesome line of, "You shoot me again, you best pray I'm dead." I'm not sure why, but I always absolutely loved this line, and they even got a phone case with it. Anyway, the final thing to come out of this episode is Glenn seeing all the walkers in the barn. And this is a major difference between the two versions, as in the comic, Herschel himself calmly says to Rick that this is where they keep all the dead. But just before we get to that, let's get through the episode fittingly named Secrets. This is the one where all the plot lines will be wrapped up. Lori tells Rick she's pregnant, and the group finds out that there are walkers in the barn. Also, if you recall what I mentioned in Season 1, Shane and Andrea visit Wiltshire Estates while searching for supplies, and they also get very close here. You know what I mean, YouTube will blast me, blah 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 blah. But this is where I believe Andrea begins on a much different path than in the books. Since Shane is no longer around in the comics, she is always loyal to Rick and is more of a background character for this part. But I don't think it's worth getting into just yet, so keep that in mind if you have not read the books. Finally, back to the barn reveal. In the books, as the survivors are getting target practice, Herschel suddenly interrupts them and says that they shouldn't shoot the walker that has just appeared. Instead, they should bring him to the barn, and just as he opens the door, a walker falls through, knocking him off balance, and the entire barn of walkers is now free to walk out. Just like with Carl being shot before, the comic book more so plays on the element of surprise. There is no build-up, it just happens, and everyone has to react right away. A bunch of them are bit, and Herschel himself opens fire, pointing the gun at himself once all the infected are dead. Rick knocks the gun away and stops him before he can pull the trigger. And the very next page is the group already grieving about the losses and Herschel admitting that Rick had been right all along. Keeping walkers is dangerous. Again, this is obviously much different from what happens in the adaptation. After the entire group finds out about the walkers in the barn, Shane is the first to immediately disapprove, and while Rick doesn't agree with the idea either, he says that it should ultimately be Herschel's decision. Though as we've seen this season already, Shane has slowly gotten more and more unhinged, and with this idea festering, it wouldn't be long until he took matters into his own hands. Though there is still one more thing that would ultimately break him. He goes to talk to Lori, blaming Rick for what happened back at the camp in Atlanta where they lost Jim and Amy, and finally bringing up the fact that Lori's baby is actually his. Essentially, the idea here is that Shane is getting sick of Rick leading the group. After he is once again pushed aside by Lori, he threatens Dale to get their guns back, deals them out to the group, and goes to clear out the barn himself. And again, they play up the emotional aspect here a lot. He gives a speech about how they've wasted their time searching for Sophia, they're living next to creatures that are trying to kill them, and even feeding them, and so on. This whole thing is further built up as Rick calls Shane his brother and begs him to stop. Though that would obviously be far too late, and Shane snaps. The barn is opened, and that's that. The last walker to come out of the barn is Sophia, and fittingly, Rick donning all black is the one to put her down. He too is now changed forever, and those badges he put away are now gone for good. The two stark differences here is of course Sophia going missing in the first place, and Herschel not doing anything in the adaptation. Though before we move on from this, I just want to talk about this scene a little more, because man, did it hit me hard. This is one of those things that I feel like made The Walking Dead the success that it ultimately became. They are absolute masters of conflicting emotions. Once again, the barn sequence opens with intense action, jump cuts, unstable camera movements, and intense close-ups on Shane. All of these things create a feeling of uneasiness. Then bang, the barn is opened and the built-up emotion is released. And just as you think it's finally over, the tenseness is juxtaposed with complete and utter hopelessness, as Sophia makes her way out of the barn. The entire arc is built on the premise of finding this little girl, only for you to realize that it was all meaningless. And now, the fast-paced jump shots are replaced with a wide shot that lingers on showing all of the characters. Unlike the walkers that were unceremoniously put down, Sophia is lingered on for much longer. Firstly, because she's obviously a character we actually know, but secondly, to once again juxtapose what just happened. Finally, we stay on Rick for unnaturally long as he walks all the way up to the camera, walks in front of the group, which is again symbolizing him being the true leader here, not Shane, and then cutting to the shot of his python as we switch focus from Rick to the cold barrel of his gun. And bang, Sophia is put down as we fade into the credits. Say what you will about Season 2, but the cinematography and writing for this episode are, if not perfect, then very close to it. In the comics, Herschel deals with the fallout quite differently from the TV version. After finding Glenn in Maggie's room, he lashes out in anger, saying that it hasn't even been 24 hours since their family members died. He storms out, and that's the end of that. We then cut to Rick and Alan, who are clearing out the barn with the hope of being able to stay there. Alan is still dealing with the death of his wife, but Rick gets fed up with the whole barn idea and just goes to ask Herschel if they can just stay in the house. A conflict breaks out between them as Laurie goes to confront him as well. He hits Laurie and even pulls a gun on Rick. In short, Herschel's coping mechanism in the comic is anger. And we even get this quick shot of Carl already preparing his gun when Herschel pulled one on Rick, calling back to what happened with Shane. Following this, Rick is just done and says that they are leaving right away. The group packs up and they're ready to go. The only one to stay behind is Glenn, who has fallen in love with Maggie and wishes to stay with her on the farm. Rick understands and wishes them happiness in the future as they head out on the road once again. And one last detail, after the confrontation with Rick, Otis goes to search for Herschel, who's cooped up on the floor, saying that he would have actually shot Rick, fearing that he has lost his mind. And I feel like this was written in by Kirkman just to let us know that Herschel did what he did because of the people he just lost, not because he actually had a problem with Rick. In short, he is still a good guy. And that is pretty much where the comic leaves off in terms of events parallel to Season 2. There will be more remixes that happen once they arrive at the prison, but broadly speaking, that is the farm arc. As you can tell, there are a lot of differences so far, not only due to Sophia and Shane, but also because of Herschel's character, who acts much differently than in the adaptation. Furthermore, Glenn stays at the farm, which for the TV-only crowd probably seems wild, but again, we'll talk about that more in the prison arc just due to how the story is structured. But we've still got plenty of events to get through in the adaptation, and luckily, what's left are all pretty amazing episodes. In the TV series, we pick up after the events of the barn reveal with Herschel digging out an old flask and going on a trip to the bar. With everyone worried about him, Rick and Glenn go on a mission to find him and bring him back. But before we get to the bar, we do get this brilliant scene of Glenn talking to Rick about his confusing relationship with Maggie. Rick, acting as the father figure here, gives him some guidance, and we just see a fun discussion between the two of them. And again, I feel like these sorts of small additions just made me enjoy seeing Steven Yeun's portrayal of Glenn even more. It's unfair to compare the mediums in this case, but seeing his sort of awkward portrayal of trying to understand his emotions was just fun to see. We then arrive at the bar, and we get what I think is still one of the best sequences in the show. While Rick is trying to talk Herschel into returning back to the farm, two other survivors stumble into the bar, Dave and Tony. Unlike the Vatos group in the first season, this time they claim to be friendly, but we see Rick's BS detector go off. Glenn, on the other hand, doesn't catch on and is acting quite friendly, with Rick being very defensive. And personally, I feel like this is another portrayal of how Shane, and then the loss of Sophia, has changed Rick. It's no coincidence that he is still wearing all black here and not his police uniform that he wore throughout the first part of the season. And this time, once Dave tries to pull on Rick's emotions to bait an answer out of him and try to make Rick relate to him, he is faced with a stone cold Rick not giving an inch. Tony gets a little triggered, but Dave tries to calm the situation down. But Rick has already made up his mind. Note the complete silence in this scene, with the only noise being the creaky floor abruptly cutting through. This again just builds that feeling of uneasiness. And just as Dave starts to laugh off the Nebraska response by Rick, he tries to pull a gun. Though, like I said, Rick's BS detector had gone off a long time ago already, and his trigger finger is a lot faster than Dave's. With no hesitation, he turns around and puts 3 more bullets in Tony. And just like that, Rick is once again changed forever. And I can't help but think that these mini-villains were also introduced to make Rick's turn on Shane more believable. After he puts down one person, each one after that is a lot less meaningful, right? The episode ends with Shane, Andrea, and T-Dog burning the pile of walkers instead of burying them. Or, in other words, burning down the once established routines and methods. The parallel to a police officer calmly putting down 2 people is pretty straightforward here. And yeah, as I said, this was to this day one of my favorite sequences in the show, so it should be no surprise that I think this was a very good addition to the TV version. Seeing these crucial steps of Rick slowly becoming the cold leader that he would later become was just awesome. And just to keep things straightforward, every single thing that happens here and after is exclusive to the TV series, so just keep that in mind. After the events of the bar, they rescue Randall, who had been left behind by his group, and we then get to see the group try to come to a conclusion of what to do with him. As we saw with Dave and Tony, his group is obviously dangerous, and just freeing him is a no-go. But there is still a tiny part of Rick that still wants to be the good guy. But even this is questioned as Lori confides in Rick about the things Shane said before. And then there's this line that essentially sets the rest of the season in motion. Lori says that Rick killed the living to protect his own, and then follows up with Shane thinks Lori and the baby is his, and that Rick cannot protect them. And just in case you didn't notice, she said killed the living to protect his own. Shane is very much still alive. Yes, she is pretty much telling Rick that Shane should be put down. That's a yikes. And it's also here that we get the infamous Rick stare. Memes aside, I do think that this is another great scene that just further establishes that idea of Rick coming to terms that he may have to do things that he once thought were unspeakable. The following episode is another one of my favorites in the entire series, and is also another one where the intro comes from much later in the episode, which is a trend for this season. 18 Miles Out, as the name suggests, is the episode where Rick and Shane drive Randall 18 miles from the camp with the intention of simply leaving him there. But all of that is secondary to Rick and Shane's interactions throughout the episode. It all begins with the car ride, where Rick is just listing off things that they should do. Get dry food, prepare for the winter, and this is also the first time Rick brings up the fact that they should be using their knives to fight off walkers. This is the episode where that pretty much starts happening. There's also this walker that Shane focuses on, and while there are countless theories surrounding the significance of this lone zombie, like hinting at the attack on the farm and so on, personally, I feel like it describes Shane in the group. As we've seen throughout the series, walkers usually form hordes, yet this one is a single lone zombie just walking his own path. And this may be an instance of me reading into it way too much again, but notice how the grass is fairly short here, but after the fight between Rick and Shane, he is still walking alone, no more fulfilled than before, and the foliage is now almost absorbing him. Either way you look at it, I think it just speaks to how well some of these episodes are crafted. A single walker we only see for a brief moment while driving a car is still incredibly memorable even 10 years later. Moving on, we get the confrontation between Rick and Shane. But despite everything that has already happened to them, their bond is too strong to kill each other just yet. They beat each other up, but ultimately, Rick still saves Shane when he is overrun by infected, and Randall is taken back to the camp. While they're driving back, we also get another brilliant piece of the Walking Dead soundtrack, that being Civilian by Y-Oak. Prepare for a lot more of this later on, but I'm an absolute sucker for the Walking Dead soundtrack, and a lot of songs from the show have ended up on my permanent playlist, and are to this day some of my favorites out there. Two final things to mention. Before they get back to the farm, Rick stops the car and says that it's time for Shane to come back, while giving him back his gun. At this point, you'd think that Shane might have gotten some sense knocked into him, but as I mentioned before, he hasn't, as it's only after this scene that we get to see the Lone Walker again, symbolizing that Shane is still an outcast. And the second one is the super iconic line that comes from this episode, Rick saying that he is not the good guy anymore. This plays into Rick's arc throughout Season 2. Ever since the premiere, Rick has gradually become more and more cold, culminating in the bar scene where he put down 2 live people for the first time. Not too much else to mention here, it's just an absolutely awesome line, and almost warns Shane of what's to come. Alright, now we enter the final act of the farm arc. They return to the farm and it's time to decide what they will do with Randall. Importantly, Dale is the only one actively petitioning to save Randall. The rest are much more wary of him, and so they don't want to just let him go. Also, Daryl has pretty much given up on wanting to do anything after the death of Sophia. He spent so much time running around the woods chasing a ghost that he is just kind of done. I didn't mention this before, but he brings this up himself after Lori confronts him about being a loner that doesn't want to do anything a few episodes before as well. There's also a very interesting conversation here to be had around decision making in a group. While pleading for Randall's life, Dale claims that by not speaking out, they are essentially going through with the intention to put him down. But Carol says that she simply does not want to decide someone's fate, and tells them to decide however they wish. And without getting too deep into this rabbit hole, I like that this sort of democratic paradox was brought up here. It sort of talks about that decision paralysis where you feel like either way you choose, you might harm someone. In this case, that being either Randall or the group. Ultimately, they go through with the initial plan to put Randall down. But before Rick can pull the trigger, Carl shows up and this stops Rick right in his tracks. He simply cannot push himself to do something like that in front of his kid. Meanwhile, Dale is fed up with the group and goes for a walk in the night, only to be snuck up on by a walker. And I didn't mention this at all before, as this video is way too long as is already, but this is the same walker that Carl didn't shoot before while he was on his adventures in the forest. Either way, the walker rips Dale open and there is no way to save him. And with Rick being unable to put him down, Daryl is the one to do so, as the gunshot echo fades into the outro. And surprise surprise, there's a meta discussion to be had here, because this death was not actually planned, as Jeffrey DeMunn, the actor who played Dale, asked to be written out the show following Darabont's firing in early Season 2. Dale's character is still alive in the comics at this point and later. There's not too much else to say here actually. The actor was simply loyal to Darabont and didn't want to be a part of the show after he was let go. In universe, however, it actually worked out in terms of story as well. Now that the voice of reason was gone, Shane began to craft his own plan to get rid of both Randall and Rick in one go. Though before we get to that, there's another meta fun fact to throw in here. No one likes spoilers, right? But what about spoilers that come directly from the source? If you were watching all the way back then you'll know that Shane's death was actually spoiled by AMC themselves, as the description on the Blu-ray pre-order clearly said Shane's last episode. A bit of a yikes, but these sorts of mishaps do happen, especially when people behind the scenes have been aware of it for months and just forget that such descriptions shouldn't be made public. Though keeping in mind what I said about the voice of reason being gone, the next episode opens with the group mourning the loss of Dale and saying that they will do better to honor him. A few things worth mentioning here before we get to the final confrontation between Rick and Shane. There is this exchange between Rick and Carl that retrospectively hits much harder. After feeling responsible for the death of Dale, Carl doesn't want his gun back, to which Rick responds that he must realize that people will die. he's going to die, mom's going to die, and that there's no way he can be ready for it. It's nothing super crucial, but I just really enjoyed the scene both when it was current, as well as looking back at it now when the characters are no longer in the show. Moving forward, as night falls, Shane executes his plan. He takes Randall into the woods, puts him down, and then smashes his face into a tree to make it appear like they had a fight. There's not too much else to dwell on here, but the notable thing is that Daryl and Glenn find the zombified Randall who had turned even though he had never gotten bitten. This would of course be confirmed by Rick next episode, who found that out way back at the CDC, but either way, this happens earlier than it did in the books, even at this point. As for the Shane and Rick duo, just like with Dave and Tony at the bar, Rick's BS detector is going off with Shane every step they take. Though Rick's still having that tiny bit of hope, he gives Shane countless more chances to turn back. But that never happens, and they make it to the field. And, oh man, I know I've been nerding out over the cinematography a lot, but this shot is fantastic. And so the confrontation happens, with Shane pulling a gun on Rick, calling him weak, and saying that he has no idea how to protect his family. Though as we see, Shane is not capable of shooting Rick either, as Rick manages to calm him down, approach him, give up his gun, and then pull a knife on him. Despite all he said, Rick was the strongest one here. I've heard many people say that if Shane were to lead the group, they would have had a much easier time with villains to come. Though I've always been of two minds about this. Yeah, Shane is absolutely ruthless, but when push came to shove, Rick still got the best of him, because in my view, he had something to fight for, while Shane had essentially lost everything at that point. This might be an interesting discussion topic for some time later, but I wouldn't definitively say that Shane would have dealt with adversaries faster or better than Rick. I think there's a lot more nuance there. Similar to the comic, Carl appears in the TV series as well, only he puts down zombified Shane, not knowing that it was actually Rick who put down Shane. After the craziness subsides, they begin to head back to the farm as we see a massive horde react to the gunshots and begin their way after them. And so, we have finally reached the finale of Season 2. The intro to the episode is another helicopter, whose purpose is a little weird to me. It obviously works to show us that all the walkers are getting dragged to the farm, but is it supposed to be a teaser for Woodbury, or is it a callback to Season 1? Who knows? Either way, the horde is coming. And so, we get our first proper Walking Dead season finale. And why do I say first? Well, personally, the CDC never really had super high stakes in my opinion, but I already talked about my conflicting thoughts on that in the Season 1 video, so let's move on from that. The brilliant thing about this episode is how it handles separate groups of characters. They all get separated and have to fight their own way through the infected. Combined with the fact that we have never actually dealt with the consequences of Shane's death, all made the sequence absolutely awesome. And how can I not mention Herschel's infinite ammo scene? I think this makes up for him not doing anything in the barn reveal scene like he did in the comics. Though retrospectively, I always seem to overestimate how long the battle for the farm really was, as it takes up less than half of the episode. So I guess that goes to show you just how memorable it really was. Luckily, everyone ends up meeting back on the road where the season began, the place where they left supplies for Sophia. And so they reunite and begin their journey back on the road, trying to find a new place to stay. Also, a small detail here, because they begin shooting in summertime, when they get to the finale, it's usually very early fall in Georgia. And so the wintertime setting in does actually work out nicely for the TV series. We see the characters talk about being cold and so on. Obviously, it's nowhere near as cool as actually seeing snow, but beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. While on the road, Rick also reveals the fact that they're all infected, which is obviously a big shock for everyone, with even Glenn criticizing Rick for keeping it from the rest of the group. And honestly, yeah, I don't see why he did. In universe, it doesn't even make too much sense why Jenner didn't tell them all right away. I mean, yeah, I guess you could say he was trying to keep morale high, But would it have really mattered that much? I don't know, it just seems like a weird plot detail that was done way better in the books, which we will talk about later. While on the road, Rick also tells Lori that he put down Shane, to which she reacts kind of weird too, considering what she said before. This too has always felt a little bizarre to me. I feel like it was clear that Shane was unhinged and that he would have ended Rick otherwise. I suppose you could argue that her reaction is so over the top because she hears Carl had to put down zombified Shane, but still, I don't really get it. Anyway, before we get back to the group, we see Andrea, who managed to get out of the farm and is stumbling through the forest alone. And just as she is about to get overrun by walkers, a hooded woman with a katana appears. And fun fact, Michonne wasn't played by Danai Gurira here, as she had not been cast yet. I tried finding out who played the character in the finale, but I couldn't seem to find any concrete information other than the fact that it was just a stand-in. In short, this was just a teaser for Season 3, and a wink at the comic book folks who already knew the character. And the final scene of Season 2 is another very iconic one. The beginning of the Rictatorship. After the survivors begin to question whether their direction is right, Rick puts an end to it, saying that he has been keeping them alive ever since the start. He follows up by saying that he killed his best friend because of them, which of course catches everyone off guard just due to how serious Rick is here. And he gives the iconic speech that should be known by every Walking Dead fan out there, finally offering anyone a chance to leave if they wish, and then telling those who plan on staying that this isn't a democracy anymore, and thus, Rictatorship. I mean, you know what I'm going to say. I absolutely love this scene, and in a way, I feel like it propels Rick ahead of his comic book counterpart in terms of his thought process in the apocalypse and as a leader. We'll talk about it more once we get to Season 3 and later, but following this night, he's a far different leader to the group, becoming even more ruthless as time goes on. And a small detail to note here, while he delivers his speech, he is holding Shane's Glock the entire time. In a way, he has absorbed a part of Shane, which sort of changes his actions here as well. As the camera flies out of the camp, we get one final glimpse of the far-off prison, hinting at what's to come. And that's Season 2. Overall, I feel like the additions to this season are a lot more successful than the ones in Season 1. The expanded Shane storyline was absolutely awesome, and was a prime catalyst for Rick's character growth, and the Sophia storyline was also super impactful for both Rick and the group as a whole. Losing a kid really does hurt a lot more. Though with that being said, I do think some subplots were dragged out a little too long, and weren't crucial for the overarching narrative, which just bloated the farm arc a little too much. I do think this did teach them a very good lesson, however, as Season 3 would be a much different story in terms of pacing, which we will get to in due time. In terms of major changes going forward, it is the introduction of Beth, who will play a larger role later, the death of Sophia, who never goes missing in the books and thus survives the whole arc through, and the death of Dale, which was more so an external factor. As I mentioned, there will be some remixes with the comic book, as the farm wasn't left because of a horde and so on, but we'll talk about that in the next video, as they aren't super important here. The core idea is that both in the comics as well as the TV show, the group is on the road and is looking for a new home. And that brings us to the end of probably one of the longest videos I've ever done. Oh boy, do these take a while to type up and edit, and my voice is almost gone. As for a few quick updates, I've got a full-time internship currently, so my usual schedule has been messed up quite a bit, but I am still trying to get in some good production time when I can. Thankfully, as you know, this channel does have the most consistent upload schedule ever, whenever they're done. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate if you did all the YouTube things to help with the blessing of the algorithm, and if you wish to support me even further by buying me a coffee, my Patreon along with all my other socials are below. But other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.